I can't lose everything with you.
You decided that fast? The company needs new leadership.
What?
Then explain why this signature isn't his.
My fortune was never gone.
So why were you waiting for the payout?
Bryan James was 44, the quiet founder of James Industrial Solutions in Columbus, Ohio. Most people believed he was simply a careful businessman who had never learned how to enjoy success. They saw the aging Ford F-150, the gas station coffee, and the man who still mowed his own lawn every Saturday. What they didn't know was that Bryan had spent years protecting a fortune almost no one could trace. The morning he announced that every dollar was gone, his wife Allison quietly slipped into the bedroom, closed the door, and made one phone call. Bryan pressed record just as her first words drifted through the wall. "If you're watching from somewhere in the world, let me know your country and your local time in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where these stories reach. And if you enjoy slow-burning suspense, smart twists, and stories where truth wins through patience instead of luck, subscribe now so you won't miss tomorrow's story." Bryan James had learned long before he built a company that patience was usually mistaken for weakness. He was born outside Newark, Ohio, the oldest son of a diesel mechanic who believed every expensive mistake began with an emotional decision. His father rarely raised his voice. Instead, he let silence do most of the teaching. Whenever something broke, he fixed it. Whenever someone lied, he waited. Time, he often said, forced every lie to become expensive. Bryan remembered those words more clearly than any lecture he had ever heard. His childhood was simple. There were no vacations to Florida, no private schools, no new trucks every 3 years. His parents measured success differently. Bills paid on time meant success. Food on the table meant success. Sleeping peacefully meant success. When Bryan turned 18, he enrolled at Ohio State University and studied industrial engineering while working nights unloading freight trailers outside Columbus. He graduated with almost no debt because every extra dollar went toward tuition instead of entertainment. At 24, he rented an aging warehouse on the western edge of Columbus with money borrowed from a local credit union and a retired family friend. The warehouse measured barely 4,000 square feet. Its roof leaked. The loading dock leaned slightly to one side. The heating system barely survived Ohio winters. Bryan called the company James Industrial Solutions. The first year produced just over $400,000 in revenue. The second year nearly doubled. He reinvested almost every dollar. Instead of buying a luxury office, he bought better inventory. Instead of purchasing a sports car, he upgraded warehouse equipment. Instead of expanding too quickly, he built dependable relationships with manufacturers throughout Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, and western Pennsylvania. 20 years later, James Industrial Solutions supplied industrial valves, hydraulic components, and precision machined equipment to manufacturing plants across the Midwest. Annual revenue exceeded $120 million. Very few people knew the real number. Even fewer understood that Bryan never relied on one source of income. Years earlier, after consulting financial experts, he quietly established several holding companies. Commercial warehouses, medical office buildings, distribution centers, dividend investments, municipal bonds, private equity partnerships. Everything was legally separated, everything carefully documented. Every major asset belonged to independent trusts instead of Bryan personally. His attorney had once smiled during a meeting and said, "You planned like someone expecting a hurricane." Bryan simply replied, "Storms don't send invitations." That habit confused people. Employees often saw Bryan eating lunch in the company cafeteria instead of expensive restaurants. He still carried the same weathered leather briefcase he'd owned for nearly 15 years. Every morning at exactly 6:45, he stopped at the Speedway on Dublin Road, greeted the same cashier named Linda, bought a medium black coffee, and drove another 12 minutes to headquarters. The security guards greeted him by first name. Warehouse employees never hesitated to approach him with questions. He remembered birthdays. He remembered children's names. He remembered whose mother had surgery. Those things mattered more than executive titles. His truck reflected the same philosophy. The dark blue Ford F-150 had nearly 200,000 miles. Its paint had faded under Ohio winters. The driver's seat showed years of use. People assumed Bryan couldn't afford anything better. He never corrected them. Appearances had become useful camouflage. He met Allison 15 years earlier during a fundraising gala at the Columbus Museum of Art. She worked in corporate marketing for a healthcare technology company. She laughed easily, asked thoughtful questions, never seemed impressed by money. Bryan admired that. Their first dates were remarkably ordinary. Coffee, walking through German Village, minor league baseball games, Saturday farmers markets. She once told him she appreciated how calm he remained in every situation. "You make everything feel safe," she had said. He believed her. For years, nothing suggested otherwise. They married in a small ceremony attended mostly by family and close friends. No celebrity venue, no extravagant destination wedding. Bryan preferred investing in their future rather than spending hundreds of thousands on one afternoon. Allison agreed, or at least she appeared to. The first several years felt genuine. She helped organize charity events, volunteered at local fundraisers, remembered anniversaries, supported Bryan during difficult business negotiations. When James Industrial Solutions expanded into Cincinnati and later Indianapolis, Allison celebrated every milestone beside him. Bryan often wondered later whether those memories had been real, or whether he had simply wanted them to be. The changes never happened overnight. That was why they were difficult to notice. First came the conversations about neighborhoods. She admired larger homes, nothing unusual. Then came luxury vacations suggested more frequently. Again, nothing unreasonable. After that came designer handbags, exclusive jewelry, private club memberships, new social circles. None of those things alone concerned Bryan. Success allowed comfortable living. He wasn't opposed to spending money. He simply believed purchases should have purpose. What unsettled him wasn't the spending. It was the growing secrecy. Her phone rarely left her hand. Face down on tables, passwords changed. Conversations stopped when Bryan entered rooms. Lunch meetings appeared on her calendar without names attached. Weekend shopping trips became longer. Business conferences somehow multiplied. Still, Bryan refused to accuse. Suspicion without evidence destroyed marriages faster than betrayal itself. He knew that. His father knew that. Emotion demanded confrontation. Discipline demanded observation. One rainy Thursday evening nearly 8 months earlier, Bryan walked into Rebecca Sullivan's downtown Columbus law office. Rebecca had represented him for almost 18 years. She understood both corporate law and Bryan's personality. After listening quietly, she folded her hands across the conference table. "So," she asked calmly, "what exactly are you asking me?" Bryan stared through the office window toward the courthouse. "I don't want revenge." Rebecca nodded. "I don't want surveillance unless there's reason." She nodded again. "I don't want to accuse my wife based on intuition." Silence. Finally, she spoke. "What do you want?" Bryan answered without hesitation. "I want the truth." Rebecca leaned back thoughtfully. "The truth usually requires patience." "I have patience. It also requires preparation." "I've spent my life preparing." Rebecca smiled faintly. "Then let's prepare correctly." The next person Bryan contacted was Michael Turner. Michael had served as James Industrial Solutions CPA for nearly 14 years. Unlike most accountants, Michael specialized in forensic financial investigations. He noticed details other people ignored: one misplaced decimal, one unnecessary transfer, one suspicious reimbursement. Tiny inconsistencies often exposed enormous fraud. Bryan trusted him completely. Michael spent weeks reviewing company structures, asset ownership trust documentation, banking relationships, and succession plans, not because something was wrong, because Bryan wanted everything unquestionably legal before moving forward. Every document underwent another review, every ownership record updated, every investment independently verified. Nothing hidden, nothing fraudulent, simply organized. Rebecca insisted on that distinction. If this becomes litigation, she warned, everything must survive judicial scrutiny. Bryan agreed. Months passed quietly. Nothing changed outwardly. Employees continued working. Neighbors continued waving. Allison continued believing life was normal. Only 3 people understood what Bryan intended. Rebecca, Michael, Bryan. No investigators. No cameras. No hidden devices. Not yet. The test itself remained surprisingly simple. A controlled public announcement. A believable financial collapse. A carefully documented business crisis. No actual assets would disappear. Only appearances would change. Rebecca reviewed every sentence of the announcement dozens of times. Michael verified every supporting financial document necessary to make the story believable without committing fraud. The announcement described catastrophic investment losses, failed acquisitions, frozen credit facilities, potential restructuring, everything legally defensible, everything carefully worded. If Allison truly loved Bryan, rather than his financial security, nothing meaningful would change between them. If something darker existed beneath the surface, Bryan suspected time would reveal it. He never imagined how quickly. Monday morning arrived gray and humid. Rain clouds covered downtown Columbus. Bryan reached headquarters before sunrise. Employees greeted him normally. Forklifts hummed inside the warehouse. Coffee brewed in the break room. Delivery trucks backed toward loading docks. Everything looked ordinary. Bryan entered his office carrying the same worn leather briefcase. Rebecca joined the meeting through secure video conference. Michael sat quietly beside Bryan. No one spoke for nearly a minute. The digital clock on Bryan's desk changed from 7:59 to 8 Udrov. Rebecca looked directly into the camera. "Once this goes public," she said, "there's no taking it back." Bryan rested his finger over the keyboard. He took one slow breath. Then he clicked the button that released the announcement to employees, lenders, suppliers, and the public all at once. Within seconds, his phone began to ring. Bryan's phone vibrated so relentlessly that he finally turned it face down on his desk. Within 3 minutes of the announcement, more than 60 unread messages had flooded his inbox. Suppliers wanted answers. Local reporters requested interviews. 2 banks asked for emergency conference calls. Employees texted one another in confusion as rumors spread faster than official statements. Outside Bryan's office, conversations became whispers. Forklift engines continued moving pallets through the warehouse, but the usual confidence had disappeared. Workers who had spent 15 or 20 years with James Industrial Solutions suddenly wondered whether they would still have jobs by the end of the month. Bryan stood beside the window overlooking the loading docks. His expression never changed. Rebecca had warned him this moment would feel uncomfortable. She had been right. Watching loyal employees worry about their futures weighed on him more heavily than he expected. He reminded himself that the uncertainty would be temporary. Michael had already prepared contingency payroll accounts. Every employee would continue receiving their wages exactly as scheduled. Only appearances had changed. Reality had not. At 8:17 a.m., Allison called. Her voice sounded breathless. "Bryan, oh my God, I just saw the news." "I know. Are you okay?" "I'm still trying to understand everything." "Should I come to the office?" "No." He deliberately kept his answers short. "I'll be home soon." "Okay, please drive carefully." She disconnected. Bryan looked at Michael. "What did you hear?" Michael asked. "Concern." And Bryan considered the question. It sounded practiced. Michael said nothing. Experienced forensic accountants rarely trusted first impressions. Neither did Bryan. By late morning, Bryan drove home through steady Ohio rain. Traffic moved slowly along Interstate 670. Dark clouds hung over Columbus, matching the mood that had settled over the city. Local business radio stations had already begun discussing James Industrial Solutions. Some analysts speculated the company had overextended itself through acquisitions. Others blamed interest rates. One commentator even suggested bankruptcy might become unavoidable. Bryan turned the radio off. The quiet suited him better. When he pulled into the driveway, Allison opened the front door before he reached the porch. She wrapped both arms around him. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Bryan hugged her back. He noticed her perfume. The expensive French fragrance had appeared only a few months earlier. She held him just long enough to appear comforting. Then she stepped back and searched his face. "What happened?" Bryan lowered his eyes. "I made some bad decisions." "What kind of decisions?" "Investments." "How bad?" He hesitated. "Almost everything." Her breathing caught. At least it sounded that way. She reached for his hand. "We'll get through this." Bryan nodded slowly. "I hope so." Inside the house, nothing looked different. Family photographs still lined the hallway. The grandfather clock still ticked quietly near the staircase. The kitchen still smelled faintly of cinnamon from breakfast. Only Bryan knew the ordinary surroundings had become a stage. Every word mattered now. Every reaction mattered. Allison offered coffee. He declined. She suggested lunch. He wasn't hungry. Instead, he sat in the living room staring at nothing in particular. The silence stretched several minutes. Finally, Allison spoke again. "Have the banks called?" "Several." "What did they say?" "They're reviewing everything." She nodded. "What about your personal accounts?" Bryan rubbed his forehead. "Most of them are frozen until the restructuring is complete." That statement was intentionally vague, legally true, carefully incomplete. Several business operating accounts had indeed been temporarily restricted as part of the staged restructuring process. His protected trusts remained entirely untouched. Allison looked away for only a second, but Bryan noticed it. Not panic. Calculation. She recovered almost immediately. "I'm going upstairs." He looked up. "Why?" "I need to call my sister." Bryan smiled faintly. "Of course." She climbed the staircase slowly. Halfway up, she glanced back. Bryan remained seated exactly where she had left him. She disappeared into the bedroom. A second later, hot click. The bedroom door closed. Bryan remained motionless. His father's voice echoed somewhere deep inside his memory. "When someone thinks you've stopped watching, that's when they begin showing you who they really are." Bryan quietly slipped his phone from his pocket. No sudden movements, no hesitation. He opened the voice recorder application, pressed record, placed the phone beside him on the couch cushion. The room fell silent again. At first he heard almost nothing, only faint footsteps upstairs, a dresser drawer opening, another closing. Then came the muffled sound of a phone dialing. 1 ring, 2, 3. Someone answered. The voice was too faint to identify. Then Allison spoke. Everything about her voice changed. The fear vanished. The warmth disappeared. Her tone became calm. Controlled, almost relieved. It finally happened. Bryan didn't move. "He believes everything is gone." Another pause. A man's voice answered quietly through her speaker, still impossible to recognize. Bryan leaned forward only slightly. His heartbeat remained steady. Allison continued, "No, he has no idea." Silence. Then she laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly. Just enough. Bryan had not heard that laugh in months. "He looked completely defeated." The man replied again. Too muffled to understand. Allison answered immediately. "We just have to wait for the insurance payout." Bryan felt every muscle in his shoulders tighten. Insurance. That wasn't part of anything he had staged. The conversation continued. Yes. Another pause. The paperwork is almost finished. Bryan's breathing slowed intentionally. He refused to react. His father had once taught him another lesson while repairing an old truck engine. If you panic too early, you'll miss the real problem. Upstairs, Allison continued speaking. No. Not yet. A pause. I don't think Rebecca suspects anything. Bryan's eyes narrowed. Rebecca. How did Allison know his attorney's name had become relevant? The man spoke again, this time longer. Allison answered softly. I'll keep him distracted. Another pause. He trusts me. Those 4 words landed harder than anything else she had said. Bryan closed his eyes for one brief second. Not because he was emotional, because he wanted to remember every syllable exactly. The call continued. No, don't transfer anything today. Another pause. Too many people are watching. Bryan's mind immediately began organizing information. Transfer, insurance, paperwork, Rebecca. Someone else involved, planning before today. The pieces no longer resembled an affair. They resembled coordination. Professional coordination. Allison lowered her voice even further. When everything clears, Bryan strained to hear. He'll sign whatever I put in front of him. The man answered. Then Allison said something that froze the room. I've waited 3 years for this. 3 years. Bryan's grip tightened around the edge of the couch. 3 years. Whatever this was. It hadn't begun recently. The bedroom floor creaked. The conversation ended. Bryan immediately stopped the recording. Not a second later. Not a second sooner. He saved the file under a neutral name. Family Recordings 01. No emotional labels, no dramatic titles, just evidence. 30 seconds later, Allison walked downstairs carrying a folded basket of laundry. She smiled gently. I talked to my sister. Bryan looked at her. How is she? Doing okay. He nodded. I'm glad. She set the laundry basket on the dining table as though nothing unusual had happened. Bryan stood. I need to make one phone call. He walked outside onto the back patio before dialing Rebecca Sullivan. She answered on the first ring. Tell me. I recorded something. How serious? Bryan looked across the wet backyard. The first phone call. Rebecca's voice became quieter. Send it. Within moments, the encrypted audio file arrived in her inbox. Bryan waited. Rain tapped softly against the wooden deck railing. 5 minutes passed, then 8. Finally, his phone rang. Rebecca spoke before Bryan could say hello. This isn't just infidelity. Bryan remained silent. Rebecca continued. This sounds like organized financial fraud. The line fell quiet. For the first time that day, Bryan realized his carefully planned test had uncovered something far larger than he had ever intended to find. Bryan did not sleep much that night. He wasn't replaying Allison's words because he doubted what he had heard. The recording had removed all uncertainty. Instead, he kept asking himself a different question. How long 3 years? That single sentence echoed louder than every other detail in the recording. 3 years meant planning. 3 years meant patience. 3 years meant someone had been building a strategy while smiling across the dinner table. At 6:30 the following morning, Bryan drove downtown to Rebecca Sullivan's office without telling Allison where he was going. The rain had finally stopped. Early sunlight reflected from the glass towers surrounding Capitol Square, but the city still looked unusually quiet. Rebecca was already waiting. So was Michael Turner. A laptop sat open in the conference room beside several legal pads and 2 thick folders. Rebecca closed the door herself. No assistance, she said. No interruptions. Bryan placed his phone on the conference table. The original recording. Rebecca nodded. I've listened to it 12 times. Michael looked up from his notes. I've listened 15. Bryan sat without speaking. Rebecca folded her hands. I want to start with something important. Bryan looked at her. You were right not to confront Allison. Why? Because yesterday gave us evidence. She tapped the folder. If you had confronted her 2 weeks ago, we'd have nothing except suspicion. Michael added quietly, Now we have timestamps. Rebecca pressed a key on her laptop. The recording began playing through external speakers. Nobody interrupted it. Nobody reacted. When Allison's words finally ended, Rebecca paused the audio. She looked directly at Bryan. Forget the affair for a moment. Bryan frowned slightly. I'm already trying. I'm serious. She slid several notes across the table. Listen to the language. Bryan read silently. Insurance payout, paperwork, transfer, Rebecca. Keep him distracted. Too many people are watching. Michael leaned forward. Those aren't emotional words. They're operational. Rebecca nodded. Exactly. This sounds organized. Bryan remained silent. Rebecca continued. People hiding affairs usually discuss emotions. They discuss relationships. They discuss fear. They don't discuss transfers. Michael opened another folder. I started reviewing your personal financial history last night. Bryan raised an eyebrow. You already found something. Michael nodded once. I found several things. He turned the laptop toward Bryan. The first screen displayed normal household accounts. Nothing unusual. Checking, savings, mortgage, utilities. Michael clicked again. Another spreadsheet appeared. These aren't yours. Bryan studied the account numbers. Whose are they? We don't know yet. Then why are we looking at them? Michael highlighted several electronic transfers. Because they repeatedly received money from vendors who also do business with James Industrial Solutions. Bryan's expression remained steady. Coincidence. I don't believe in coincidences. Michael enlarged the transaction history. The transfers were never large enough to attract immediate attention. $4,000, $6,000, $8,000, $12,000. Always irregular, always different, always months apart. Rebecca spoke carefully. Someone understood banking compliance thresholds. Bryan looked at Michael. How far back? Michael answered without hesitation. 32 months. Bryan immediately recognized the number. Almost 3 years. Rebecca watched him make the connection. Exactly. Michael continued scrolling. The payments increased gradually. Very disciplined. No sudden spikes. No obvious pattern. Just enough to disappear among ordinary commercial transactions. Bryan leaned back. So someone has been siphoning money. Possibly. Michael corrected himself. Actually. He pointed to another screen. Someone has been preparing. That a word mattered. Preparing. Not stealing impulsively. Building something. Rebecca stood and walked toward the window. I'd like to bring someone else into this. Bryan looked up. You trust him? I do. He spent 24 years with the FBI. Financial crimes. He now works private investigations. Bryan thought for only a second. Bring him in. 20 minutes later, a tall man in his late 50s entered the conference room carrying nothing except a notebook. His gray hair was cut short. His navy suit looked ordinary. Everything about him suggested someone who preferred being forgotten. Rebecca introduced him. Marcus Reed. Marcus shook Bryan's hand firmly. I've heard good things. Bryan smiled faintly. I wish we were meeting under different circumstances. Marcus sat. Rebecca summarized everything in less than 10 minutes. She played only selected portions of Allison's recording. Marcus never interrupted. When the recording finished, he asked only one question. Has your wife changed her routine recently? Bryan thought carefully. Not dramatically. What has changed? Longer lunches, More business conferences. More privacy. Marcus wrote several lines. Anything else? She's become very protective of her phone. Marcus nodded. What vehicle does she drive? A white Mercedes GLE. License? Bryan recited it from memory. Marcus smiled slightly. You notice details. My father taught me. Rebecca spoke next. No illegal surveillance, Marcus answered immediately. Never. We stay completely inside the law. Bryan appreciated that answer. He had no interest in shortcuts. Evidence obtained improperly often destroyed otherwise strong cases. Marcus closed his notebook. I'll begin with public observations. No trespassing. No wiretaps. No hidden cameras. Only places where there's no reasonable expectation of privacy. Rebecca looked at Bryan. Agreed. Bryan nodded. Agreed. Marcus stood. I'll contact you only if something significant develops. By noon, everyone had returned to work. Bryan deliberately maintained his routine. He answered employee questions. He met department managers. He reassured suppliers that operations continued. Every performance had an audience. He wanted anyone watching to believe the financial collapse had consumed his attention. Meanwhile, Michael continued quietly examining records. Late that afternoon, Bryan received an encrypted message. From Michael. One sentence. Need to see you immediately. Bryan drove back to Rebecca's office. Michael already had another spreadsheet waiting. This one bothered me. Bryan studied it. The transactions weren't withdrawals. They were luxury purchases. Designer jewelry, high-end hotels, private charter deposits, exclusive boutiques in Chicago, Nashville, Miami. Most purchases had been made through a limited liability company Bryan had never seen. Michael enlarged the company registration. Silver Oak Consulting LLC. Registered 18 months earlier. Owner information unavailable through public filing. Rebecca frowned. Shell company? Probably. Michael nodded. The interesting part isn't the company. It's who keeps paying it. He highlighted another series of transactions. 3 corporate vendors. Every one of them supplied equipment to James Industrial Solutions. Bryan slowly exhaled. So someone inside my business. Likely, Michael replied. Very likely. Rebecca looked toward Marcus, who had quietly entered moments earlier without interrupting. You have something. Marcus placed 3 printed photographs on the conference table. The pictures had obviously been taken from a public sidewalk. Nothing invasive, nothing illegal. The first showed Allison leaving an upscale salon. The second showed her walking across the street. The third made Bryan stop. Allison entered the Renaissance Columbus downtown hotel. She wasn't alone. A man wearing a charcoal suit walked beside her. Only his profile appeared clearly. Bryan recognized him instantly. Not because of the suit, not because of the haircut, because he had worked beside Bryan for more than a decade. Rebecca looked at Bryan without speaking. Marcus quietly asked, Do you know him? Bryan never looked away from the photograph. His voice remained calm. Yes. Marcus waited. Bryan finally answered. That's Ethan Parker. Rebecca frowned. Your COO? Bryan nodded once. My chief operating officer. Silence filled the conference room. The betrayal no longer pointed only toward his marriage. It had reached the executive offices of James Industrial Solutions. Marcus slowly slid one final photograph across the table. It showed Allison and Ethan entering the hotel's private executive elevators together. Neither of them looked worried. Neither of them looked surprised. They looked like 2 people who had done this many times before. Bryan stared at the image for several seconds. Then he looked at Marcus. Keep following them? Marcus nodded. I already intend to. Rebecca gathered the photographs into the folder. If they're this comfortable. She paused before finishing her thought. They're going to make another mistake. Bryan looked once more at Ethan's face in the photograph. For 12 years, he had trusted that man with confidential contracts, expansion plans, supplier negotiations, and board meetings. Now, for the first time, he wondered whether the greatest threat to his company had never come from competitors. It had been sitting in the office next to his all along. Bryan drove to headquarters the next morning with the photograph of Ethan Parker still fresh in his mind. For 12 years, Ethan had occupied the office directly across the executive hallway. He had attended board meetings, negotiated supplier contracts, represented James Industrial Solutions at industry conferences, and celebrated every major expansion beside Bryan. There had never been a reason to question him, until now. Bryan parked his aging Ford F-150 in its usual space and walked through the front entrance exactly as he did every weekday. The receptionist greeted him with a nervous smile. "Good morning, Mr. James." "Good morning, Sarah." Her expression carried concern rather than suspicion. She, like everyone else inside the building, believed the company faced financial disaster. Bryan hated that. His employees deserved stability, but revealing the truth too early would destroy the investigation. As he entered the executive floor, Ethan stepped out of his office carrying a leather portfolio. He smiled warmly. "Bryan." "Morning." "I've been trying to reach you. I turned my phone off." "I figured." Ethan placed a reassuring hand on Bryan's shoulder. "We'll get through this." Bryan looked into his eyes. The performance was flawless. There was no hesitation, no visible guilt, no sign that the man standing before him had spent the previous afternoon entering a downtown hotel with Bryan's wife. Bryan simply nodded. "I appreciate that. We should meet. I've already scheduled the board." "When?" 10 o'clock. Ethan smiled again. "Then I'll prepare updated projections." Bryan watched him walk away. His father had once said that the most dangerous liars weren't the ones who looked nervous. They were the ones who looked comfortable. At exactly 10, the executive conference room filled with department heads, operations, finance, sales, human resources, legal. Everyone waited for Bryan to speak. He stood beside the presentation screen. "The announcement yesterday created understandable concern." Several executives exchanged uneasy glances. "Our operations continue. Our customer commitments continue. Our payroll continues." Relief spread across several faces. Bryan intentionally kept his explanation limited. He wanted the company's leadership to believe only what they needed to know. Questions followed, most focused on suppliers and financing. Ethan answered many of them before Bryan could. He sounded confident, knowledgeable, prepared, almost too prepared. Bryan quietly noticed that Ethan repeatedly emphasized one particular point. "If conditions worsen," Ethan said, "we may need temporary executive authority to make rapid financial decisions." Bryan said nothing. The board members nodded thoughtfully. One of them asked, "Would that require additional signatures?" Ethan answered immediately. "Only temporarily. Standard emergency governance." Bryan made a mental note. Temporary executive authority. Interesting. After the meeting ended, Ethan remained behind. Everyone else filed out. Only the two men remained. Ethan closed the conference room door. "You don't look surprised?" Bryan smiled faintly. "I've had a long 24 hours. I've been reviewing options." "What kind of options?" Ethan opened his portfolio. Inside were several folders. Emergency restructuring. Vendor negotiations. Credit protection. Leadership continuity. Bryan flipped casually through the pages. Everything appeared professionally prepared, nothing obviously suspicious. Still, the documents seemed unusually complete, almost as though someone had expected this exact situation. "When did you prepare these?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "Last night." Bryan looked up. All of this? I didn't sleep. Neither did Bryan. But producing nearly 200 pages of corporate restructuring documents overnight would have been nearly impossible. Unless some of them already existed. Bryan closed the folder. I'll review everything. Take your time. Ethan smiled again. I'm here for you. Bryan thanked him. As Ethan left the room, Bryan immediately photographed every page before locking the folders inside his office safe. Half an hour later, he met Rebecca. She examined the documents carefully. Interesting. What? She pointed toward one signature line. This authorization. Bryan leaned closer. What about it? It transfers significant operational authority. Temporarily. So it claims. Rebecca continued reading. The wording bothers me. She highlighted one paragraph. Read the last sentence. Bryan did. The language appeared harmless at first glance. However, one clause quietly expanded executive authority beyond ordinary operations into long-term contractual obligations. Rebecca folded the document shut. This wasn't written overnight. You think so too? I know so. She opened another page. The formatting differs. The legal citations use outdated revisions. This draft began months ago. Bryan slowly nodded. So Ethan expected something. Rebecca looked directly at him. Or someone expected to need this. Meanwhile, Michael Turner continued examining company records. By early afternoon, he called. I found purchase orders. Bryan drove directly to his office. Stacks of invoices covered Michael's desk. What's wrong? Michael separated several files. These vendors. Bryan recognized every company, steel distributors, machining suppliers, transportation contractors. What about them? Michael tapped the invoices. They're legitimate companies. So, the purchase orders aren't. Bryan frowned. Michael enlarged digital copies on his monitor. The signatures authorizing these purchases, Bryan immediately recognized them, his own, except they weren't. They're forged. Michael nodded. Very good forgeries. Good enough that accounts payable approved them. Bryan examined another file. Then another. Then another. The signatures varied slightly each time. Whoever created them had practiced. This isn't random, Michael agreed. I counted 23 forged approvals. Over how long? About 2.5 years? Again, almost 3 years. Every timeline pointed toward the same beginning. Michael opened another spreadsheet. The purchases themselves aren't fake. They happened. The inventory arrived. Bryan looked confused. Then where's the fraud? Michael smiled grimly. Quantity. He highlighted one invoice. The company ordered 100 hydraulic valves. The invoice billed 140. Bryan immediately understood. 40 extra units, never delivered, still paid. Michael continued. It happens again. And again. And again. Every order contained modest overbilling. Never outrageous. Never enough individually to trigger audits. Only together did the pattern emerge. Bryan asked quietly. Total tonner. Michael rotated the monitor. Estimated overbilling 4872,316. Bryan stared at the number. Nearly $5 million. Michael leaned back. I don't think Ethan acted alone. Bryan agreed. No. Someone inside accounting approved payments? Someone at the vendors cooperated. And probably someone expected those documents never to receive forensic review. Rebecca joined them an hour later. She reviewed Michael's findings silently. Finally, she said, We still don't confront anyone. Bryan nodded. We're missing pieces. Exactly. She pointed toward the forged approvals. Fraud cases collapse when people move too early. We need motive. We need money flow. And we need communication. Marcus Reed entered moments later. He carried another envelope. I've been busy. He removed several photographs. The first showed Ethan leaving company headquarters. The second showed him stopping at a suburban office building. The third revealed something different. Ethan entered a law office, not Rebecca's. Bryan studied the building directory. The firm specialized in corporate acquisitions. Marcus placed another document beside the photographs. I checked public records. The attorney recently formed 3 limited liability companies. Bryan looked at Rebecca. Can we identify clients? Not through public filings, Marcus added, but we can identify timing. When? The first company formed 29 months ago. Again, nearly 3 years. Bryan no longer believed the timeline was coincidence. Someone had started constructing an elaborate financial structure years before his staged collapse. Marcus pointed toward the final photograph. Ethan stayed inside for almost 2 hours. When he left, Marcus slid another picture across the table. Bryan immediately recognized the woman waiting beside Ethan's car. Allison. Neither of them appeared rushed. Neither seemed worried. They looked like business partners finishing another ordinary meeting. Rebecca quietly gathered every photograph. We're seeing the outline now. Bryan looked at her. What outline? She answered carefully. A coordinated plan. Corporate fraud. Asset acquisition. And probably divorce. Michael nodded. They've been building this long before your financial test. Bryan stared at the photographs. His fake collapse hadn't created the conspiracy. It had simply forced it into the open. Rebecca closed the folder. Good. Bryan looked surprised. Good? She nodded. They think they're winning. And people who believe they've already won. She smiled slightly. They usually stop being careful. Bryan understood exactly what she meant. For the first time since the investigation began, he realized patience was no longer simply protecting him. It was encouraging his enemies to expose themselves even further. The following week unfolded exactly as Rebecca had predicted. The more Bryan appeared defeated, the more confident Allison and Ethan seemed to become. Bryan deliberately embraced the role. He stopped wearing tailored suits to the office and replaced them with older Navy jackets that had hung untouched in his closet for years. He canceled his membership at the private executive dining club downtown and began eating simple sandwiches in the employee cafeteria. Rumors spread quickly. Some employees whispered that their CEO was trying to save every dollar. Others assumed the banks had frozen his personal assets. Bryan never corrected anyone. Every misunderstanding strengthened the illusion. Only Rebecca, Michael, and Marcus knew that Bryan's actual fortune remained untouched inside carefully structured trusts beyond the reach of the fabricated financial crisis. On Thursday evening, Allison placed several envelopes on the kitchen table. I need to talk to you. Bryan looked up from his coffee. Of course. She sat across from him. There was a sadness on her face, or at least an imitation of sadness. I've been thinking. Bryan nodded. So have I. She folded her hands together. I don't know if we're going to survive this. Bryan lowered his eyes. I understand. The answer seemed to surprise her. She had probably expected resistance, an argument, desperation. Instead, Bryan simply waited. She reached for one of the envelopes. I met with an attorney. Bryan looked at it without touching it. I figured you might. She blinked. You did. We've both had difficult weeks. She slowly pushed the envelope toward him. I think maybe we should separate. Bryan remained silent long enough to make the moment uncomfortable. Finally, he asked quietly, Is this what you really want? She looked away. I don't see another choice. Bryan studied her expression. Years earlier, he would have believed every tear collecting in her eyes. Now he noticed something different. She never actually cried. The tears never fell. They remained perfectly controlled, almost rehearsed. "I won't make this harder than it already is," Bryan said. Relief flashed across her face. It lasted less than a second, but Bryan saw it. She quickly replaced it with sorrow. "I'm sorry." "I know." She stood and quietly returned upstairs. Bryan waited until he heard the bedroom door close before photographing every page inside the envelope. Then he placed the documents inside his briefcase. Less than an hour later, Rebecca examined them inside her office. She read every page twice, then a third time. Finally, she removed her reading glasses. "This is fascinating." Bryan sat forward. "What is the divorce petition? What about it?" Rebecca pointed toward the financial disclosures. "They're incomplete." Bryan frowned. "How?" "They deliberately exclude several categories of marital assets." Bryan looked more closely. She was right. Entire investment classes had been omitted. Business interests had been broadly described without supporting schedules. Retirement disclosures appeared unusually vague. Rebecca continued. "Whoever drafted this expected you to sign without careful review." Bryan smiled faintly. "They still think I'm emotionally overwhelmed." "Exactly." She circled another paragraph. "This clause concerns me even more." Bryan read silently. "In the event of extraordinary financial hardship affecting one spouse, temporary management authority over jointly held business interests may be assigned to the remaining spouse until legal proceedings conclude." Bryan slowly looked up. So if I sign," Rebecca finished the sentence, "Allison gains temporary control." "Not permanent." "Temporary." Rebecca nodded. Temporary authority often becomes permanent when combined with other corporate documents. Bryan immediately thought about Ethan's restructuring package. Temporary executive authority, temporary marital authority. Separate documents, identical timing. Rebecca smiled. "They're fitting together." Michael arrived moments later carrying another folder. "I've identified additional irregularities." Bryan laughed softly. "I'm beginning to expect that." Michael placed several insurance policies across the conference table. Bryan immediately recognized them. Corporate liability, executive life insurance, key person protection, property coverage. "What am I looking at?" Michael pointed toward the executive life insurance policy. "This beneficiary amendment." Bryan read the document. Nothing appeared unusual until he noticed the signature date. 3 months earlier. "I never signed this." Michael nodded. "I know." Bryan compared it with his genuine signature. Again, a forgery. Rebecca leaned closer. "What changed?" Michael answered quietly. "The beneficiary percentages." Bryan read more carefully. If the amendment had been accepted as genuine, the distribution of benefits following Bryan's death would have changed significantly. Several payments redirected toward entities Bryan had never authorized. One beneficiary listed only an unfamiliar trust name. Michael highlighted it. Silver Oak Executive Trust. Bryan immediately recognized the first 2 words. Silver Oak. The shell company. Rebecca looked toward Michael. "Can we trace it?" "I already tried." "Nothing. Only another attorney." Marcus entered just then, carrying a cup of black coffee. "You'll like this." He placed a flash drive on the table. "Traffic camera footage." Bryan looked surprised. "Public." Marcus nodded. "Completely legal." The footage showed Ethan's Mercedes entering the underground parking garage beneath the same law office Marcus had photographed days earlier. The timestamp mattered. 3 months ago. The exact day the forged insurance amendment had supposedly been signed. Michael slowly leaned back. "They weren't reacting to your fake bankruptcy." "They were preparing for something long before it," Rebecca agreed. The conspiracy existed independently. Bryan stared at the paused video. Every answer created two new questions. Marcus continued. I also followed Ethan yesterday. He visited another location. Where? A document storage company. Bryan frowned. What kind? Commercial archive services. Rebecca immediately understood. Physical records? Marcus nodded. He spent 40 minutes inside. What did he remove? I couldn't see. But Marcus produced another photograph. He left carrying 2 banker boxes. Bryan studied the image carefully. One box bore a familiar company logo, James Industrial Solutions. Michael looked toward Bryan. If original accounting records disappear, Bryan finished the sentence. Forgeries become harder to prove. Rebecca stood immediately. We move now. Bryan looked up. Confront him? No. She shook her head firmly. We preserve evidence. Within an hour, Rebecca obtained emergency legal preservation notices requiring the document storage company to retain every remaining corporate record. Everything happened quietly. No accusations, no lawsuits, simply official notices preventing destruction. Marcus smiled. If Ethan goes back, he'll find locked files. Bryan nodded approvingly. By Friday afternoon, another unexpected development arrived. Allison approached Bryan in the living room carrying a folder. I talked to my attorney. Bryan looked up. They think we should resolve everything quickly. I agree. She seemed surprised again. You do. I don't want a long fight. Her shoulders visibly relaxed. I knew you'd understand. She opened the folder. There are just a few financial forms. Bryan accepted them calmly. I'll review them. No need to take long? He smiled politely. I always read before signing. For the first time since the fake bankruptcy began, genuine disappointment crossed Allison's face. It disappeared almost immediately, but not before Bryan noticed it. Later that evening, Rebecca examined the new paperwork. She almost laughed. They're getting impatient. Bryan looked at her. What makes you say that? She spread the documents across the table. They've become careless. Michael leaned over. What did they miss? Rebecca tapped 3 separate signature pages. They forgot to update the dates. Bryan examined them. She was right. 2 documents referenced board resolutions that technically did not yet exist. Another cited a restructuring agreement scheduled for approval the following week. The paperwork had been prepared before the events it supposedly described. Rebecca smiled. Someone assumed no one would actually read the legal language. Bryan slowly closed the folder. They're rushing. They are. Marcus nodded from across the room. And rushed people. Rebecca finished the thought with quiet confidence. Make expensive mistakes. Bryan looked out the office window toward the lights of downtown Columbus. For the first time since pressing the button that announced his fake financial collapse, he felt the balance beginning to shift. The people who believed they were manipulating him had started abandoning the patience that had protected them for nearly 3 years, and Bryan knew from experience that the moment disciplined people become impatient is often the exact moment they lose everything. Monday morning began with an email that was never supposed to reach Bryan. At 7:42 a.m., Michael Turner called before Bryan had finished his first cup of coffee. You need to come in. Bryan recognized the tone immediately. What happened? I'll explain when you get here. 20 minutes later, Bryan walked into Michael's office at company headquarters. The forensic accountant already had 3 monitors displaying transaction histories, email headers, and scanned insurance documents. Rebecca Sullivan arrived less than 5 minutes later. Marcus Reed followed shortly afterward. Michael pointed toward the center monitor. We caught a mistake. Bryan looked closely. An internal email had been mistakenly copied to a departmental archive that Michael routinely monitored during the financial review. The sender was Ethan Parker. The recipient wasn't Allison. It was someone named Daniel Hargrove. The subject line read only policy status. Rebecca frowned. "Who's Daniel Hargrove?" Michael typed rapidly. "I checked. He works for Midwestern Executive Insurance Services." Bryan immediately remembered the company. They managed several executive insurance policies for James Industrial Solutions. Michael enlarged the message. The email itself had already been deleted from Ethan's mailbox. However, the archived copy remained. It contained only one sentence. "Confirm payout timeline before signatures are finalized. No greeting, no signature, nothing else." Rebecca looked toward Bryan. "Insurance again?" Bryan nodded slowly. "The same word Allison used." Marcus crossed his arms. "This is getting more specific." Michael opened another document. "I called the insurer this morning." Rebecca looked up sharply. "As yourself?" "No. As the company's CPA." "What did they say?" Michael smiled slightly. "They were surprisingly cooperative. Because James Industrial Solutions remained the policyholder, Michael had legitimate authority to verify administrative details. They confirmed someone requested beneficiary verification twice during the past 4 months. Bryan frowned. "Who?" "They couldn't tell me." "But," Michael highlighted another page. "Both requests originated from the Executive Administration Office." Bryan immediately understood. Only a handful of people worked there. His executive assistant, human resources, Ethan. Rebecca looked thoughtful. "Nobody requests beneficiary confirmations without a reason." Marcus agreed, especially twice. Michael continued. "I asked another question." "What?" "Whether any claims had been initiated." Bryan stared at him. "And no." Silence filled the room. Michael leaned back. "But they asked something unusual." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "What?" "They wanted to know whether Mr. James remained actively employed." Bryan exchanged a glance with Rebecca. Why would an insurance company ask that Michael answered before either of them spoke? Because someone recently asked whether coverage would remain valid if executive responsibilities transferred to another officer. Rebecca quietly exhaled. "There it is." Bryan looked at her. "What?" "The insurance wasn't only about death. It was about authority." Michael nodded. "If someone controlled executive authority, they could influence policy administration." Marcus opened his notebook. "Meaning," Rebecca answered, "if Bryan signs the restructuring documents and signs the divorce documents, someone else temporarily controls the company." Michael added, "And once temporary authority exists, insurance decisions become much easier to manipulate." Bryan remained silent. The conspiracy was growing more sophisticated with every discovery. This wasn't simply about stealing money. It was about legally positioning themselves to control every important corporate mechanism before anyone realized what had happened. Later that afternoon, Marcus called. "I have visual confirmation." Bryan met him in Rebecca's office. Marcus spread several photographs across the conference table. The first showed Allison entering a downtown financial planning office. The second showed Ethan arriving 10 minutes later. The third showed Daniel Hargrove joining them. Bryan studied the photographs carefully. The insurance representative looked to be in his early 50s. Expensive suit, leather briefcase, confident posture. Rebecca examined the timestamps. 3 people. Same meeting. 48 minutes. Marcus nodded. Public building? They entered separately. They left separately. Professional. Bryan looked toward Marcus. Could you hear anything? No. Only observe. Rebecca preferred it that way. Evidence gathered lawfully remained admissible. Speculation did not. Michael suddenly noticed something inside one photograph. Zoom in. Marcus enlarged the image. Daniel Hargrove carried a blue presentation folder. Across its front appeared the logo of Midwestern Executive Insurance Services. Partially visible beneath the folder sat another document. Only 2 words could be read. Key person. Michael looked immediately toward Bryan. Your key person insurance policy. Bryan understood. Large companies often purchased key person insurance on executives whose death or disability would significantly affect operations. James Industrial Solutions had carried such policies for years. Rebecca spoke quietly. If they somehow manipulate executive authority, they also influence claim administration, Bryan nodded. They're building multiple exit strategies. Michael smiled grimly. Exactly. If one fraud fails, they still have another. That evening, Bryan returned home. The atmosphere inside the house felt strangely peaceful. Allison prepared dinner. She smiled warmly, asked about his day, complimented his shirt. Everything appeared normal. Too normal. Halfway through dinner, she casually asked, "Have the banks made any progress?" Bryan shrugged. "Not much." "What about the restructuring?" "They're still reviewing proposals." She nodded thoughtfully. "Ethan must be working hard." Bryan watched her carefully. "He is. I always liked him." "I know," she smiled. "He's loyal." Bryan almost laughed. Instead, he took another sip of water. Loyal. The word sounded almost ironic now. After dinner, Allison carried dishes into the kitchen. Bryan remained seated in the dining room. He quietly observed her reflection in the dark window above the sink. She checked her phone 3 separate times within 2 minutes. Typed quickly, deleted something, typed again, then placed the phone face down as soon as she heard Bryan stand. Later that night, after Allison had gone upstairs, Bryan received an encrypted message from Marcus. 1 photograph, nothing else. It showed Ethan leaving a printing company. Bryan immediately called. "What is it?" Marcus answered quietly. "I think they're preparing final documents." "How do you know?" "I watched him leave." "He wasn't carrying marketing materials. He carried boxed legal binders." Bryan looked again at the photograph. The binders appeared professionally indexed: corporate acquisitions, executive agreements, legal exhibits. Rebecca joined the conference call moments later. "They're assembling closing packages." Bryan frowned. "Closing what?" Rebecca answered. "Whatever they believe happens after you sign." Michael suddenly interrupted. "I've got something." Everyone turned toward him. He displayed another spreadsheet. I compared Ethan's calendar with company activity. Bryan looked at the highlighted dates. Several meetings appeared ordinary. Supplier negotiations, board sessions, vendor reviews. Michael highlighted another column. Now compare those dates with Allison's travel calendar. Rebecca slowly smiled. The overlap was remarkable. Whenever Ethan scheduled unexplained external meetings, Allison somehow happened to be attending shopping trips, conferences, charity events, or personal appointments in the same city. Chicago, Indianapolis, Nashville, Cleveland. Every trip appeared unrelated, together. They formed a pattern stretching almost 3 years. Marcus quietly summarized what everyone else had begun realizing. They've been coordinating. Not occasionally. Consistently. Bryan leaned back in his chair. 3 years. 3 years of synchronized calendars. 3 years of forged documents. 3 years of shell companies. 3 years of insurance inquiries. 3 years of pretending nothing was wrong. Rebecca closed the laptop. They've invested too much to walk away now. Michael agreed. They'll push forward. Marcus looked toward Bryan. The question is, when? Bryan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he remembered something Ethan had said during the executive meeting. Emergency executive authority. Temporary, fast decisions. He slowly looked toward Rebecca. I think I know. She understood almost instantly. They're waiting for the board. Bryan nodded. The next board meeting. If they believe I'm desperate enough, they'll expect me to sign everything in one day. Rebecca smiled. And that's exactly when we'll be ready. Bryan looked out across the lights of Columbus through the office window. For weeks he had been reacting to evidence. Now for the first time he believed he could predict his enemy's next move. And if his prediction proved correct, the next board meeting would no longer be about saving James Industrial Solutions. It would become the moment the entire conspiracy finally stepped into the light. The board meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 9 o'clock. By Wednesday afternoon, Bryan was convinced that Ethan and Allison expected it to become the turning point of their entire plan. Rebecca believed the same thing. So, she said, spreading several binders across the conference room table. Tomorrow we stop reacting. Bryan looked at her. We let them make the first move? Michael nodded. They've invested almost 3 years into this. They won't walk away. Marcus leaned against the wall with his notebook. They think you're cornered. They'll expect desperation. Bryan smiled faintly. They're going to be disappointed. Rebecca handed him a yellow legal pad. I want you to remember one rule. What? Don't accuse anyone. Bryan looked surprised. Even if they hand me fraudulent documents? Especially then, Rebecca spoke calmly. The person who talks first usually reveals the most, Michael agreed. If Ethan believes he's winning, he'll explain more than he should. That evening, Bryan returned home. The atmosphere inside the house felt strangely peaceful. Allison had cooked one of his favorite meals, roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh green beans. It reminded Bryan of their early years together when they had celebrated every small success, because neither of them had possessed very much. For one brief moment he wondered whether any part of those years had been genuine. Then he pushed the thought aside. Evidence mattered. Memories did not. During dinner, Allison smiled more than she had in weeks. You seem calmer. Bryan shrugged. I've accepted reality. She nodded slowly. Sometimes acceptance is the healthiest choice. He looked directly at her. I think you're right. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. I'm proud of you. Bryan almost asked what exactly she was proud of. Giving up, trusting her, preparing to sign away everything. Instead, he simply smiled. After dinner, Allison disappeared upstairs for nearly 40 minutes. Bryan didn't follow. Marcus had already explained that surveillance teams positioned outside the neighborhood would document anyone arriving or leaving. At exactly 8:54 p.m., Bryan's encrypted phone vibrated. One message, white Mercedes leaving residence. 5 minutes later, another message appeared. Vehicle stopped at Riverside Executive Plaza. Bryan knew the address immediately. The same office complex where Daniel Hargrove maintained his insurance office. He quietly placed the phone back into his pocket before Allison returned downstairs. Everything okay? She asked. Just work. She smiled. You should try resting. I will. She kissed his cheek before heading towards the bedroom. Bryan watched her disappear down the hallway. The woman kissing him goodbye had just returned from another secret meeting. Yet she behaved as though nothing unusual had happened. The next morning, Bryan woke before sunrise. He stood alone on the back porch holding a cup of black coffee. His father's old advice returned once more. Never rush the harvest. The fruit falls when it's ready. At 8:45 a.m., Bryan entered the executive boardroom. The directors gradually filled their seats. Department heads arrived, corporate counsel, outside auditors, senior executives. Finally, Ethan Parker walked in carrying 2 leather portfolios. He looked unusually confident. Bryan noticed something else. Daniel Hargrove sat quietly near the end of the table. Officially, he attended as an insurance consultant, reviewing executive coverage during the restructuring. Rebecca whispered quietly, "Convenient." Bryan nodded. Very convenient. The meeting began routinely. Financial summaries, operational updates, vendor reports. Nothing unexpected. Then Ethan stood. "I've prepared an emergency continuity proposal." Bryan folded his hands. "Go ahead." Ethan distributed thick binders around the room. Every director received one. Bryan received 2. "This proposal protects James Industrial Solutions during this difficult transition." Several board members began reading. The language sounded reassuring. Temporary authority, operational flexibility, rapid decision-making, business continuity. Everything appeared reasonable on the surface. Exactly as Rebecca had predicted, Ethan continued speaking confidently. "If approved today, we eliminate uncertainty." One director looked toward Bryan. "What do you think?" Bryan slowly opened the binder. He turned pages deliberately, never rushing. Finally, he reached the signature page. He looked up. "Before I sign..." The room became quiet. "I'd like clarification." Ethan smiled. "Of course." Bryan pointed toward one paragraph. "This clause." Ethan glanced down. "Standard language." Rebecca remained perfectly silent. Bryan continued. "It authorizes executive control beyond 90 days. Ethan answered immediately. "Only if necessary." Bryan turned another page. "And this one?" "The language regarding asset disposition." Ethan barely hesitated. "Purely administrative." Another board member frowned. "I hadn't noticed that." Bryan calmly continued reading, one by one, page after page. Every additional question forced directors to examine the documents more carefully. Several began highlighting sections. Others exchanged concerned looks. Ethan's confidence faded only slightly. Still, he maintained control. Then Daniel Hargrove unexpectedly spoke. "The insurance provisions should also be executed today." Rebecca looked up for the first time. "What insurance provisions?" Daniel smiled politely. "Executive continuity policies." Rebecca folded her hands. "Could you identify which policies?" Daniel hesitated. "Key person coverage?" Rebecca nodded slowly. "I see." She looked toward Bryan. "Have you authorized any amendments recently?" Bryan answered calmly. "No." Silence settled over the room. Daniel looked toward Ethan, only for a fraction of a second. But everyone saw it. Rebecca noticed first. "So there are amendments." Daniel immediately corrected himself. "Potential amendments." Rebecca smiled politely. "Interesting." One of the independent directors looked confused. "I wasn't aware amendments existed." "Neither was I," Bryan said. The room became noticeably quieter. Michael Turner entered unexpectedly carrying another binder. Bryan had arranged his arrival precisely. "Excuse the interruption." Bryan stood. "I've asked our forensic accountant to present updated findings." Several directors looked surprised. Ethan looked irritated. Michael connected his laptop to the presentation screen. The first slide displayed purchase orders. The second displayed forged signatures. The third showed overbilling totals exceeding $4 million. The room erupted into whispers. Ethan immediately stood. "These numbers haven't been verified," Michael answered calmly. "They have." "By whom?" 3 independent forensic accounting methods. He advanced another slide. Forged executive signatures appeared side by side with authentic ones. The differences became obvious. Another director spoke. "Who approved these?" Michael answered honestly. "We're still determining that." Rebecca intentionally avoided naming Ethan. Not yet. She wanted him talking, exactly as planned. Ethan crossed his arms. This investigation should have been brought to management. Bryan looked directly at him. It has. Ethan frowned. What do you mean? I am management. Several directors quietly nodded. Michael displayed another slide. Insurance beneficiary amendments. Unsigned originals. Forged copies. Timeline comparisons. Daniel Hargrove's face noticeably changed. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Rebecca watched carefully. Then she asked one simple question. Mr. Hargrove. He looked toward her. Who requested these amendments? The room became completely silent. Daniel opened his mouth, closed it again, looked toward Ethan, then toward Bryan. Rebecca repeated the question. Who requested them? Daniel swallowed. Before he could answer, Ethan interrupted. That's confidential. Rebecca immediately replied. Not if they're forged. Silence. Absolute silence. For the first time that morning, Ethan looked genuinely unsettled. Bryan watched him carefully. The confident executive who had entered carrying prepared legal binders no longer looked certain. He looked trapped. And Bryan realized something important. The meeting had not yet exposed the conspiracy, but it had accomplished something almost as valuable. For the very first time in nearly 3 years, Ethan Parker had lost control of the room. No one spoke for several long seconds after Rebecca challenged Daniel Hargrove. The silence inside the boardroom felt heavier than any argument. Every director around the polished walnut table looked from Daniel to Ethan, then back again. Daniel loosened his tie. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Rebecca remained calm. Then let's clear it up. She slid a copy of the insurance amendment across the table. Did you receive this document? Daniel glanced down. His face changed almost imperceptibly. I've seen something similar. Bryan noticed Ethan clench his jaw, only for a moment. Then the practiced confidence returned. Ethan, Bryan said quietly, had you ever seen this amendment before today? Ethan didn't hesitate. No. Rebecca immediately placed a second document beside the first. This email requested confirmation of the amendment. Daniel's expression hardened. I don't recall. Michael calmly connected another laptop to the conference room display. I expected that answer. The next slide showed the archived email recovered from the company's internal server. Sender Ethan Parker. Recipient Daniel Hargrove. Subject policy status. The timestamp matched the week before the board meeting. The room fell silent again. One independent director adjusted his glasses. Mr. Parker, Ethan answered before the question finished. That email has been taken out of context. Rebecca smiled politely. Wonderful. Then please give us the proper context. Ethan looked toward the board. We were reviewing continuity planning. Nothing more. Rebecca nodded. So, continuity planning required forged beneficiary amendments. I never said they were forged. Michael spoke before Rebecca could answer. They are. He enlarged both signatures. One genuine, one fabricated. High-resolution forensic overlays. Highlighted stroke differences invisible to the naked eye, but unmistakable under magnification, Michael explained calmly. The pressure sequence differs. The pen lifts differ. The terminal strokes differ. The signature was traced using a digital reference. Several directors exchanged uneasy glances. The chairman of the board finally spoke. Mr. Turner, can you state your conclusion? Michael answered without emotion. The signature is not authentic. The chairman slowly turned toward Bryan. Did you sign this document? No. Did you authorize anyone else to sign it? No. The chairman nodded thoughtfully. Understood. Ethan realized the room was changing. He stood. I think we're losing sight of the company's actual problems. Bryan watched him carefully. Our financial collapse? Bryan interrupted gently. What financial collapse? Every eye in the room turned toward him. Even Rebecca looked up. Not because she didn't know what Bryan intended, because timing mattered. Bryan slowly stood. I believe everyone deserves complete information. He removed a sealed folder from his briefcase. Rebecca had prepared it days earlier. Inside sat certified statements from every protected trust, every holding company, every diversified investment account legally separated from the operating company. Bryan handed copies to each director. You've all spent the past 2 weeks believing I lost everything. Several directors immediately began reading. One looked confused. Another looked stunned. Bryan continued. I never said my personal fortune disappeared. I announced that James Industrial Solutions faced a severe financial crisis. That statement was legally accurate. He paused. The company entered a planned restructuring exercise. Every employee continued receiving full salary. Every supplier continued receiving payment. No retirement account was touched. No protected trust lost a dollar. Daniel stared at Bryan. Ethan's face became expressionless. Bryan continued. My family's personal assets remain intact. Several directors looked from one financial statement to another. One whispered, My God. Another looked toward Ethan. So none of this, Bryan answered calmly. Was the opportunity anyone believed it was? Rebecca stood beside him. Our legal team intentionally monitored all activity following the public announcement. She paused. And the results have been illuminating. Michael displayed another slide. A timeline. 34 months. Every suspicious transfer, every forged signature, every shell company registration, every unexplained insurance inquiry, every suspicious meeting, every forged authorization, every questionable vendor payment. The timeline formed a continuous chain. Marcus Reed entered, carrying 2 additional binders. He quietly placed them on the table. Observation logs. One director looked surprised. Observation? Marcus nodded. Lawful surveillance conducted entirely from public locations. He opened the first binder. Photographs, dates, times, locations. Allison meeting Ethan, Ethan meeting Daniel, Daniel entering the insurance office, Ethan removing banker boxes from document storage. Every image contained timestamps verified by digital metadata. Rebecca never accused anyone. She simply presented evidence. The chairman slowly turned each page. The other directors did the same. Nobody spoke. Finally, Ethan laughed. It sounded forced. So what? The room looked toward him. You have photographs. You have emails. You have theories. Rebecca answered quietly. No. We have records. She handed another folder to the chairman. These arrived this morning. The chairman opened it. Certified bank subpoenas, wire transfer histories, beneficial ownership disclosures. Michael smiled slightly. The shell company wasn't actually invisible. It only required court authorization. Bryan watched Ethan carefully. For the first time since the investigation began, genuine uncertainty appeared in his eyes. Michael continued. Silver Oak Consulting, LLC. He clicked another slide. Corporate ownership structure appeared. The company belonged to another LLC. That LLC belonged to a trust. The trust listed 2 beneficiaries. The first name appeared, Ethan Parker. Nobody looked surprised. The second name appeared, Allison James. Complete silence. Bryan didn't move. He had already known the answer, but seeing her name displayed on the boardroom screen still hurt more than he expected. Several directors looked directly at Ethan, then toward Bryan, then back again. The chairman slowly removed his glasses. Mrs. James? Michael nodded. 50% beneficial interest. The chairman asked quietly, "Can you prove it?" Rebecca handed him certified incorporation records, filed with the Secretary of State. Authenticated yesterday. The chairman reviewed them carefully. Everything matched. Corporate addresses, formation dates, registered agents, ownership transfers. Nothing appeared fabricated. Everything had been obtained legally. Daniel Hargrove quietly lowered his head. Rebecca noticed immediately. "Mr. Hargrove." He looked up. "Would you like to revise any previous answers?" Daniel remained silent. Rebecca waited. Bryan said nothing. Silence often accomplished more than pressure. Finally, Daniel spoke. "I was told—" He stopped. Rebecca waited patiently. "I was told Mr. James already knew." Bryan looked directly at him. "Knew what?" Daniel swallowed. "The divorce. The restructuring. The insurance changes." Ethan said everything had already been discussed privately. Bryan's voice remained calm. It had not. Daniel closed his eyes. For several seconds, nobody interrupted him. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded exhausted. "I never intended to participate in fraud." Rebecca asked gently, "Then why did you continue?" Daniel looked toward Ethan. "He said the company was collapsing. He said emergency restructuring required temporary changes. He said Mr. James approved everything verbally." Michael quietly asked, "Did you ever verify that—" Daniel shook his head. "No." The chairman slowly leaned back in his chair. "I think we've heard enough." Ethan stood immediately. "This is ridiculous." "No criminal charges have been filed." Rebecca smiled politely. "Not yet." She slid one final document across the table. A federal preservation order. The chairman read it carefully. His expression became serious. "What is this?" Rebecca answered. "This morning, every relevant financial record, email, archive document, storage facility, insurance file, banking institution, and vendor account received preservation notices. No records may legally be destroyed. No electronic files may be altered. No corporate devices may be replaced." Marcus quietly added, "And no one involved has been informed." He looked directly at Ethan. Until now. Ethan understood instantly. Every possible escape route had already been closed. The forged documents, the deleted emails, the insurance records, the shell companies, the accounting files. Everything had been preserved before this meeting even began. Bryan slowly gathered his own papers. He looked across the boardroom at the man he had once trusted to help build his company. "You spent nearly 3 years preparing for the day you thought I'd lose everything." He paused. "You never considered the possibility." Bryan's voice remained calm. That I was the one testing all of you?" No one answered. Because for the first time since Bryan had announced the collapse of his fortune, every person in that room understood exactly who had truly been trapped. The board meeting adjourned without another vote. No one attempted to approve Ethan's restructuring proposal. No one asked Bryan to sign the divorce-related corporate documents. Instead, the directors quietly collected their binders while exchanging uneasy looks with one another. The chairman addressed everyone before leaving. "Effective immediately, no executive authority will be transferred. All proposed restructuring documents are suspended. Every relevant financial record is to remain untouched pending independent review." He paused before looking directly at Ethan. "That includes your office?" Ethan forced a professional smile. "Of course." The chairman then turned toward Bryan. "I'd appreciate speaking with you privately." Within minutes, Bryan, Rebecca, Michael, Marcus, and the chairman remained inside the boardroom. The chairman slowly closed the door. I owe you an apology. Bryan shook his head. You had no reason to suspect any of this. I still should have asked more questions. Rebecca spoke gently. Manipulation works because it appears reasonable. The chairman nodded. I've served on corporate boards for almost 20 years. I've seen hostile takeovers. Accounting fraud. Executive misconduct. But I've never seen someone spend 3 years preparing for a crisis that didn't actually exist, Bryan answered quietly. They weren't preparing for a crisis. They were preparing for an opportunity. The chairman looked at the financial statements again. So, your fortune. Bryan smiled faintly. It never disappeared. Rebecca opened another folder. We believe that's precisely why the conspiracy failed. The chairman looked confused. Michael answered. They built their plan around the assumption that Bryan would become financially desperate. They expected him to sign anything. They expected creditors to pressure him. They expected panic. Marcus added, they never imagined the collapse itself was an illusion. The chairman slowly nodded. And now, Rebecca answered immediately, now we preserve every piece of evidence. No public accusations. No press conference. No emotional confrontation. Bryan agreed. They'll make more mistakes. Meanwhile, Ethan returned to his office. Marcus watched from across the street through a camera with a long telephoto lens. Every movement remained lawful. Every photograph came from public property. At 2:18 p.m., Ethan closed his office blinds. At 2:26 p.m., he carried 2 storage boxes toward the executive parking garage. Marcus immediately called Rebecca. He's moving documents. Rebecca didn't hesitate. Stay where you are. Within 15 minutes, 2 uniformed officers arrived with legal preservation orders previously prepared by Rebecca's firm. They entered the building. Marcus remained outside. Several minutes later, Ethan emerged from the elevator. He no longer carried the boxes. His expression had changed completely. He looked angry. More importantly, he looked frightened. Marcus quietly photographed every moment. Bryan received the images before the hour ended. Rebecca smiled when she saw them. He tried. Bryan nodded. He knows we're closing in. Michael called shortly afterward. I found another surprise. Bryan met him in the forensic accounting office. Michael displayed a chart covering nearly 4 years of company operations. Blue bars represented legitimate vendor payments. Red bars represented suspicious overbilling. Near the end of the timeline, the fraudulent transactions increased dramatically. Bryan frowned. They accelerated. Michael nodded. After your fake collapse. Rebecca immediately understood why. They believed time was running out. Michael zoomed in further. During only the previous 3 weeks, nearly 40% of the fraudulent activity had occurred. Bryan leaned closer. They got greedy. Exactly. Michael highlighted several emergency invoices approved during the supposed financial crisis. Everyone had been authorized by Ethan. Everyone involved previously identified vendors. Everyone contained inflated quantities. Rebecca quietly smiled. Greed destroys discipline. Marcus walked in carrying another envelope. I've identified someone new. Bryan looked up. Another participant. I think so. Marcus spread several surveillance photographs across the table. The woman appeared to be in her early 40s. Professional appearance, dark business suit, briefcase. She met repeatedly with Ethan, then separately with Allison. Michael examined the photographs. I've never seen her. Marcus handed over another sheet. Her name is Linda Foster. What does she do? Senior Accounts Payable Supervisor. Bryan immediately recognized the position. Every major vendor payment ultimately passed through Linda's department. Michael slowly nodded. That explains how inflated invoices escaped detection. Rebecca looked thoughtful. We still need proof. Marcus smiled. I have something. He produced another photograph. Linda leaving the same downtown law office previously visited by Ethan. The timestamp matched the day before the forged insurance amendment had appeared. Bryan studied the picture carefully. Every new discovery reinforced the same conclusion. This had never been a two-person conspiracy. It had required people inside accounting, inside insurance, inside executive leadership, possibly even outside vendors. Rebecca gathered the photographs. The network is bigger than we first believed. Bryan remained remarkably calm. We keep following the evidence. No assumptions. No shortcuts. That evening, Bryan returned home. The house felt unusually quiet. Allison sat alone in the living room reading. She looked up as Bryan entered. How did the meeting go? Bryan placed his briefcase beside the door. It was interesting. She smiled carefully. Interesting. The board postponed several decisions. Her expression changed ever so slightly. Postponed? Yes. I thought Ethan had everything prepared. Bryan looked directly at her. So did I. For the first time, she seemed uncertain. What happens now? Bryan shrugged. More reviews? More audits? More legal work. She tried to hide her disappointment. I see. Bryan sat across from her. You seem worried. I'm just tired. He nodded. So am I. Neither of them mentioned the board meeting again. Later that night, after Allison had gone to sleep, Bryan stepped quietly into his home office. His encrypted phone vibrated. Rebecca. Conference call. Now, within minutes, Rebecca, Michael, Marcus, and Bryan were connected. Marcus spoke first. After Ethan left the office, he didn't go home. Where? The airport. Bryan frowned. He flew somewhere. No. He met someone. Marcus displayed several new photographs through the secure video conference. Ethan stood beside a black SUV near the private aviation terminal. Another man exited the vehicle. Bryan had never seen him before. Marcus enlarged the image. I identified him. Who is he? Richard Sloan. What does he do? Corporate bankruptcy specialist. Rebecca looked at Bryan. They're changing strategies. Michael agreed. The restructuring failed. They're looking for another way. Marcus nodded. They met for nearly an hour. No aircraft. No travel. Only conversation. Bryan asked the obvious question. What would a bankruptcy specialist want now? Rebecca answered quietly. Maybe they finally realized your fortune never disappeared. Michael looked at Bryan. If that's true, they're improvising. Bryan slowly leaned back in his chair. Improvisation. That single word mattered. For nearly 3 years, Ethan had operated according to a carefully constructed plan. Now the plan had collapsed. People who relied on preparation often became unpredictable when forced to improvise, but they also became careless. Rebecca closed her notebook. Tomorrow we begin the civil filings. Marcus added, and I'll keep watching. Michael smiled. I'll keep digging. Bryan looked at the 3 people who had stood beside him since the first recording outside his bedroom door. 3 weeks earlier, he believed he had been testing only his wife. Now he understood the truth. His fake financial collapse had exposed something far larger than marital betrayal. It had uncovered an organized conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of his company. And with every failed attempt to recover control, the people responsible were leaving behind even more evidence than Bryan had ever hoped to find. The civil complaint was filed at exactly 8:30 the following morning. Rebecca had spent the previous night reviewing every exhibit one final time, refusing to allow a single unsupported allegation into the filing. When Bryan arrived at her office, she handed him a copy nearly 3 inches thick. The cover page carried the names of every defendant: Ethan Parker, Allison James, Silver Oak Consulting LLC, Linda Foster. Several unidentified corporate entities listed as John Doe defendants pending additional discovery. Bryan slowly turned the pages. Every accusation was supported by documents, bank records, corporate filings, vendor invoices, insurance correspondence, digital communications, photographs. Nothing relied upon speculation. Rebecca watched him silently. Finally, Bryan looked up. "Are we ready?" She nodded. "We've been ready for days. We were simply waiting for them to make one more mistake." Michael entered, carrying another folder. "They made it." Bryan smiled faintly. "I suspected they would." Michael placed several freshly printed bank records onto the conference table. "Yesterday afternoon. The same day as the board meeting." "What happened?" "Ethan authorized 2 emergency wire transfers." Bryan looked at the dates. The transfers had been initiated only 90 minutes after the board meeting ended. Destination accounts belonged to vendors already under investigation. Michael continued. "He tried moving almost $600,000. "Did the transfers clear?" Michael shook his head. "No. The preservation orders froze them." Rebecca smiled. "Perfect." Bryan looked surprised. "Perfect." "The timing." She tapped the transfer records. "He attempted to move money after learning we were investigating. That demonstrates consciousness of wrongdoing." Michael nodded. "It also destroys any argument that the payments were routine." Bryan quietly closed the folder. For nearly 3 years, Ethan had appeared disciplined. Within 24 hours of losing control, he had begun making obvious mistakes. Marcus arrived moments later carrying another report. "I've been following Allison." Bryan looked toward him. "How is she reacting?" Marcus placed several surveillance photographs on the table. "She's scared." The pictures showed Allison visiting 3 different law offices in 2 days. None were the attorney who had prepared her divorce paperwork. Bryan recognized desperation immediately. "What are they?" "Criminal defense firms." Rebecca wasn't surprised. "They're looking for separate representation." Marcus nodded. "They've stopped appearing together. No more meetings. Not in public." Michael leaned forward. "That's important," Rebecca agreed. "When conspirators stop trusting each other, they become witnesses." Bryan understood exactly what she meant. The strongest criminal organizations rarely collapsed because investigators discovered everything. They collapsed because fear destroyed loyalty. By lunchtime, news of the lawsuit had spread throughout Columbus's business community. Bryan's phone filled with messages. Former clients, industry partners, community leaders. Most expressed surprise. Some offered support. A few admitted they had never trusted Ethan. Bryan answered only those messages requiring immediate business attention. Everything else could wait. Shortly after 2 o'clock, Rebecca received the first unexpected phone call. She listened quietly for several moments, then thanked the caller. After ending the conversation, she looked toward Bryan. "Interesting." "What?" "Linda Foster." Bryan raised an eyebrow. "She called you?" Rebecca nodded. "She wants immunity." Marcus smiled. "That didn't take long." Rebecca checked her watch. Less than 6 hours after being served. Michael laughed softly. "I expected at least a day." Rebecca called Linda back immediately. The meeting took place inside Rebecca's office later that afternoon. Bryan remained in another conference room. Rebecca believed witnesses often spoke more freely without the primary victim present. Michael and Marcus observed through the one-way viewing window. Linda entered looking exhausted. She carried no lawyer, only a small notebook. Rebecca greeted her politely. "Thank you for coming." Linda nodded weakly. "I don't want to go to prison," Rebecca answered honestly. "I can't promise anything." "I know." Linda sat quietly before speaking again. "I made terrible decisions." Rebecca waited. No interruptions, no pressure. Linda finally opened the notebook. "I wrote everything down." Rebecca looked at it carefully. "What is it?" "A record." "Of what?" "Every instruction Ethan ever gave me." Marcus quietly looked toward Michael. Michael simply nodded. Linda continued speaking. "I started keeping notes because—" She hesitated. "Because I became afraid." Rebecca asked gently, "Afraid of what?" That one day someone would blame only me." She slid the notebook across the desk. "I never created fake invoices. I processed them. I never forged signatures. I ignored obvious problems." Rebecca slowly opened the notebook. Every page contained dates, vendor names, invoice numbers, conversations, specific instructions, even meeting locations. Linda had unknowingly created a chronological roadmap of the conspiracy. Marcus whispered quietly, "This is unbelievable." Michael nodded. "If it's accurate," Rebecca looked up. "Why keep this?" Linda stared at the floor. "Because Ethan promised everything was temporary. He said Bryan would lose the company anyway. He said no one would ever notice." Rebecca asked another careful question. "What about Allison?" Linda swallowed. "I only met her twice." "Where?" "At Ethan's house." Bryan's attention sharpened immediately. Rebecca continued. "What did they discuss?" "I wasn't supposed to hear." Linda paused. "They were arguing." "About what?" "The insurance money." Rebecca exchanged a glance with Marcus. "What exactly did you hear?" Linda closed her eyes, trying to remember. "Allison said," she spoke slowly, "if he refuses to sign, then none of this matters." The room became completely silent. Linda continued. Ethan answered, "He'll sign once he believes he's completely broke." Bryan closed his eyes for a brief moment. The fake financial collapse had not merely exposed the conspiracy. It had directly triggered their final phase. Rebecca asked one final question. "Did either of them mention harming Bryan physically?" Linda immediately shook her head. "No. Never. They only talked about bankrupting him. Taking control. Making everything legal." Rebecca nodded. "Thank you." After Linda left, Bryan entered the room. Rebecca handed him the notebook. He carefully read several pages. Every date matched Michael's financial timeline. Every meeting matched Marcus's surveillance. Every invoice matched accounting records. The notebook independently corroborated nearly every major discovery made during the investigation. Michael leaned back in his chair. "This changes everything." Rebecca agreed. "It transforms a complicated financial case into a coordinated conspiracy," Marcus added quietly, "and she's only the first one talking." Almost as if summoned by those words, Rebecca's assistant knocked on the office door. "There's another call," Rebecca answered. "From who?" The assistant looked surprised. "Daniel Hargrove." Rebecca accepted the call. The room remained silent while everyone watched her expression. She listened for nearly 2 minutes, then calmly answered, "Yes, I believe that's possible." "No. You shouldn't discuss anything over the phone." Another pause. "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. She ended the call. Bryan looked at her. "Well?" Rebecca smiled for the first time that day. "He wants to cooperate." Marcus laughed quietly. "Insurance is falling apart." Michael added, Accounting has already started. Bryan looked out the office window toward downtown Columbus. 1 week earlier, he had worried that proving the conspiracy would require months of litigation. Now, the participants themselves were beginning to dismantle it. Not because investigators had forced them, because they no longer trusted one another. Rebecca gathered the growing stack of witness materials. The evidence is becoming overwhelming. Bryan nodded. But we stay patient. Rebecca smiled. Exactly. Because the first witness tells you what happened. She looked at the notebook Linda had surrendered. The second witness tells you why. And the third witness, she closed the file carefully, usually tells you who planned everything from the beginning. The room fell quiet as everyone realized the next morning's meeting with Daniel Hargrove might finally answer the one question that still remained unresolved. Who had conceived the conspiracy nearly 3 years earlier, and whether Ethan Parker had truly been its architect or merely another participant following someone else's plan. Daniel Hargrove arrived at Rebecca Sullivan's office precisely at 9 o'clock the next morning. Unlike Linda Foster, he came with an attorney. Rebecca expected nothing less. Insurance professionals understood legal exposure better than most people. Bryan watched from an adjoining conference room through the one-way observation glass while Rebecca greeted both men professionally. No recording devices other than the official court reporter, Rebecca said. Daniel's attorney nodded. Agreed. The court reporter activated the recording system. Rebecca began with routine questions: name, occupation, professional licenses, employment history. Daniel answered calmly. Only when the discussion reached James Industrial Solutions did his confidence begin to fade. Mr. Hargrove, Rebecca asked, how long have you handled executive insurance policies for James Industrial Solutions? Approximately 5 years. Who was your primary contact? Ethan Parker. Were you introduced to Mr. Parker by Bryan James? No. Who introduced you? Daniel hesitated. Ethan contacted me directly. Rebecca glanced at the timeline in front of her. What was the purpose of the meeting? He said the company wanted to modernize executive insurance planning. Did you meet Bryan James during that process? Eventually. But most communications came through Ethan. Rebecca nodded without reacting. She already knew the answer. She simply needed it preserved under oath. Michael Turner sat beside Bryan, taking notes. So, Ethan isolated communication from the beginning? Bryan nodded silently. Rebecca continued. Mr. Hargrove, did Bryan James ever instruct you to alter beneficiary designations? No. Did he ever authorize you verbally? No. Did he ever authorize anyone else to act on his behalf? Daniel slowly answered. No. Rebecca allowed several seconds of silence before asking the next question. Then why were beneficiary amendments prepared? Daniel looked toward his attorney. The attorney gave a slight nod. Daniel exhaled. Because Ethan said they would become necessary. Rebecca spoke carefully. Necessary for what? He said Bryan would lose control of the company. When he didn't give an exact date. What explanation did he provide? Daniel swallowed. He said creditors would eventually force restructuring. Rebecca asked another question. Did he mention divorce? Daniel lowered his eyes. Yes. The room became noticeably quieter. What exactly did he say? Daniel answered slowly. He told me Bryan's marriage would end. He said Allison would receive temporary authority over several jointly held assets. He wanted insurance paperwork to match the future ownership structure. Bryan stared through the glass. Ethan hadn't been reacting to Bryan's fake financial collapse. He had predicted Bryan's divorce years before it supposedly began. Rebecca asked the obvious follow-up. How could Ethan know Bryan would divorce? Daniel hesitated again. I asked him that once. What did he say? He laughed. And he told me, Daniel paused. So, some outcomes only require patience. Bryan felt a chill run down his spine. Rebecca remained composed. Did Ethan ever explain what he meant? No. Did Allison ever attend meetings involving insurance? Twice. What role did she play? Mostly listening. Did she ever discuss beneficiary changes? No. What did she discuss? Daniel took a deep breath. The timing. Rebecca leaned forward slightly. Timing of what? The divorce filing. Bryan looked toward Michael. Neither man spoke. The pieces were fitting together faster than either had imagined. Rebecca continued methodically. Did anyone instruct you to forge signatures? No. Who provided the signed documents? Ethan. Did you verify the signatures? No. Why not? Daniel looked genuinely ashamed. Because I trusted him. Rebecca quietly wrote several notes. Trust. The same word Bryan had repeated in his own mind countless times. Trust had allowed the conspiracy to survive for years. The deposition continued for another 2 hours. By lunchtime, Rebecca had established several critical facts under oath. Bryan had never authorized insurance changes. Ethan controlled communications. Allison knew about the planned divorce timeline. Insurance documents had been prepared long before Bryan announced any financial problems. When the deposition ended, Daniel remained seated. There is something else. Rebecca looked up. You are still under oath. I know. He reached into his briefcase. I found this yesterday. He removed a sealed envelope. I kept it because something about it never felt right. Rebecca accepted the envelope carefully. Inside was a handwritten note. No signature, no date, only one sentence. When Bryan signs process every amendment immediately, Rebecca immediately sealed the note inside an evidence sleeve. Where did this come from? Daniel answered. It was attached to my meeting folder. Who gave it to you? Ethan. Did he write it? I don't know. But it was waiting on my desk after our meeting. Rebecca looked toward the court reporter. Please mark this as Exhibit 42. Daniel's attorney quietly closed his notebook. The deposition ended. After Daniel left, Bryan entered the conference room. Rebecca handed him a copy of the transcript summary. He gave us exactly what we needed. Bryan nodded. But not everything. Rebecca smiled. No. We're still missing one final piece. Marcus entered, carrying another surveillance report. I think I found it. Everyone turned toward him. What happened? Ethan finally met Allison again. Bryan frowned. I thought they'd stopped. They had. Until last night? Marcus placed several photographs on the table. The meeting occurred inside a quiet public park just outside Columbus. No restaurants, no offices, no hotels. Just 2 people sitting on a bench after dark. They looked nervous, Marcus said. They argued. Could you hear anything? No. But Marcus enlarged one photograph. Allison held an envelope. A thick envelope. Another photograph showed Ethan refusing to take it. A third showed Allison placing the envelope back into her purse before walking away alone. Rebecca studied the sequence carefully. They're no longer working together, Michael agreed. They're negotiating. Bryan stared at the photographs. The partnership that had appeared unbreakable only days earlier was beginning to fracture. Later that afternoon, Rebecca received another surprise. This time it wasn't a phone call. It was a formal notice from Allison's attorney. Bryan read the first page carefully. His wife was withdrawing her divorce petition. He looked at Rebecca. That's unexpected. Rebecca shook her head. No. It's predictable. How? She no longer wants discovery. Bryan understood immediately. A divorce trial would expose financial records. Bank transfers, communications, corporate ownership, everything. Michael smiled. She's trying to stop the process. Rebecca nodded. But she can't. The civil fraud case already exists. Bryan quietly folded the notice. So she's trapped. Exactly. Marcus looked at the timeline covering the conference room wall. Every major event now appeared connected. The fake bankruptcy, the secret phone call, the hotel meetings, the forged insurance documents, the shell companies, the board meeting, the failed wire transfers, the witness cooperation, the withdrawn divorce. Nothing stood alone anymore. Rebecca stepped back and examined the wall for nearly a full minute. Finally, she spoke. I think we're ready. Bryan looked toward her. For what? The depositions of Ethan and Allison. Michael raised an eyebrow. Together? Rebecca shook her head. No. Separately. Marcus smiled knowingly. So they can't coordinate. Exactly. Rebecca gathered the files into 2 separate stacks. One deposition for Ethan. One for Allison. They'll each believe the other has already confessed. Bryan slowly smiled. They'll spend more time correcting each other than defending themselves. Rebecca returned the smile. That's usually how the truth appears. Bryan looked once more at the evidence surrounding him. Only a month earlier, he believed he had lost the woman he loved. Now he understood he had uncovered something far larger than betrayal. The conspiracy was collapsing from within, not because of dramatic confrontations, not because of clever tricks, but because every lie required another lie to survive. And after 3 years of deception, Ethan and Allison were finally running out of lies. The depositions of Ethan Parker and Allison James were scheduled for the same Friday morning. Rebecca had intentionally arranged them in separate conference rooms on different floors of the same building. Neither of them knew exactly when the other would testify. Neither knew what evidence had already been presented. Most importantly, each believed the other might already have begun cooperating. It was a strategy Rebecca had used only a handful of times during her career. Fear often accomplished what confrontation never could. Bryan arrived before sunrise. He stood quietly beside the large windows overlooking downtown Columbus as Rebecca reviewed the final preparation. No surprises today, she said. We ask only questions we already know the answers to. Michael organized financial exhibits into numbered binders. Marcus confirmed the chain of custody for surveillance photographs. Every document had been authenticated. Every digital file had been preserved. Every witness statement had been notarized or recorded under oath. There would be no dramatic reveal. Only facts. At exactly 9 o'clock, Ethan Parker entered conference room A with 2 attorneys. He looked different from the confident executive Bryan had known. His suit remained expensive. His posture remained straight. But the easy confidence in his expression had disappeared. Rebecca greeted him professionally. After the oath was administered, she began with routine questions. Employment history, responsibilities, authority within James Industrial Solutions. Ethan answered clearly. He appeared composed. Then Rebecca shifted the conversation. Mr. Parker, did you create Silver Oak Consulting LLC? No. Did you own any interest in that company? No. Rebecca opened Exhibit 51, certified ownership records from the Secretary of State. She placed them in front of him. Would you please review the highlighted section? Ethan read silently. His attorney leaned over to examine the document. Rebecca waited. Finally, Ethan spoke. I invoke my Fifth Amendment rights regarding that question. Rebecca simply nodded. No further questions on that subject. She moved immediately to another topic. Did you authorize emergency vendor payments totaling approximately $592,000 on the afternoon of the board meeting? They were legitimate business expenses. Michael handed Rebecca another binder. She removed 3 invoices. These invoices reference equipment deliveries. Did the equipment arrive? I believe so. Rebecca turned toward Michael. Michael calmly answered. No deliveries occurred. He displayed shipping confirmations obtained directly from the freight carriers. Every shipment number had been fabricated. Ethan remained silent. Rebecca asked another question. Would you like to revise your answer? I decline. Again, she simply nodded. One by one, every topic followed the same pattern. Rebecca asked. Evidence appeared. Ethan denied. Documents contradicted him. Eventually, he stopped volunteering explanations altogether. Meanwhile, 2 floors above Allison sat across from another attorney from Rebecca's firm. Rebecca had deliberately divided responsibilities, so neither deposition would be delayed. Bryan observed Allison's testimony through a secure video connection. She appeared exhausted. Unlike Ethan, she struggled to maintain composure. She answered simple questions about her marriage, the beginning of her relationship with Bryan, her involvement with company events. Everything remained calm until the questioning reached the phone call Bryan had secretly recorded weeks earlier. The attorney pressed a button. The recording began playing. Allison's own voice filled the conference room. It finally happened. He believes everything is gone. We just have to wait for the insurance payout. Bryan listened silently. Although he had heard the recording many times, hearing it inside a legal proceeding carried a different weight. The attorney allowed the recording to finish before speaking. Mrs. James, is that your voice? Allison stared at the table. After several long seconds, she answered quietly. Yes. Were the statements edited? No. Were they taken out of context? She hesitated. I don't know. The attorney remained patient. What context would explain waiting for an insurance payout after your husband believed he had lost everything? Allison said nothing. The silence lasted nearly 30 seconds. Finally, she whispered, I'd like a break. The deposition paused. Rebecca walked into Bryan's observation room. She's breaking. Bryan nodded. What about Ethan? He hasn't admitted anything. But he stopped denying specific documents. Michael joined them. That's actually helpful. How? He understands every false statement creates another problem later. Marcus looked toward the video monitor. What do you think Allison will do? Rebecca answered without hesitation. She'll make a decision during the break. Either she would continue protecting Ethan, or she would begin protecting herself. 20 minutes later, the deposition resumed. The attorney asked only one question. Mrs. James, do you wish to correct any earlier testimony? Allison looked exhausted. She folded her hands together, then slowly nodded. Yes. Bryan watched without blinking. I want to correct something. The attorney waited. I said I didn't know the context. I do. Another long silence followed. Allison took a deep breath. I knew Bryan wasn't actually bankrupt. The room became perfectly still. Bryan frowned. Rebecca looked surprised for the first time in weeks. The attorney spoke carefully. What do you mean? I realized it after the board meeting. You realized? Yes. When the restructuring failed. When Ethan became frightened. I understood Bryan had never lost everything. The attorney asked another question. When did Ethan realize it? I don't know. But after that meeting, he stopped talking about taking over the company. He only talked about protecting himself. Bryan exchanged a glance with Rebecca. This was new information. The attorney continued. Did Ethan plan the conspiracy? Allison immediately answered no. Bryan looked sharply toward the screen. Rebecca's expression changed. The attorney remained calm. Who did? Allison closed her eyes. For several seconds, no one spoke. Finally, she whispered, I did. The room froze. Bryan felt the words hit harder than any evidence he had seen. Not because he doubted them, because he had spent weeks believing Ethan was the mastermind. The attorney spoke softly. "Please explain." Allison began crying quietly. "It started after Bryan created the family trusts. I realized," she struggled to continue, "I would never control anything. Even if we stayed married." The attorney asked, "So what happened?" I complained. "To Ethan." He said there might be another way. Together we developed the idea. Bryan slowly sat down. Rebecca remained silent. Every assumption they had carried throughout the investigation had just changed. The attorney continued. "Who first suggested the fake vendor invoices?" "Ethan." "Who suggested the divorce?" "I did." "Who suggested changing the insurance paperwork?" "Ethan." "So the plan evolved together?" "Yes." "But," she paused, "I wanted the marriage to survive. I only wanted financial control." The attorney asked quietly, "What changed?" Allison looked directly ahead. Greed. Neither the attorney nor anyone observing interrupted. Allison continued speaking. "At first we justified everything. We said Bryan already had enough. We convinced ourselves nobody would suffer. But every successful lie made the next one easier. Then we needed shell companies. Then forged signatures. Then insurance. Then divorce. It never stopped." Tears rolled down her face. "I kept telling myself I could quit. But every time," she shook her head, "I was already too far inside." Downstairs, Ethan's deposition continued. He still denied nearly everything. He still refused to answer several questions. He still invoked constitutional protections. He had no idea that only 2 floors above him, Allison had just dismantled nearly every remaining defense. Rebecca quietly turned off the observation monitor. She looked toward Bryan. "Now we know." Bryan nodded slowly. The conspiracy had not been built by one manipulative executive controlling a vulnerable wife. It had been born from a choice they had made together. 2 people feeding each other's ambition until deception became their normal way of living. Bryan stood silently beside the window overlooking Columbus. He felt no satisfaction, only sadness. Because after everything the investigation had uncovered, the most painful truth was also the simplest. The woman he had trusted with his life had not been manipulated into betraying him. She had chosen the first step herself, and every step afterward had become easier until there was no honest path left to return home. 6 months later, the Franklin County Courthouse was filled long before the proceedings began. The civil fraud case against Ethan Parker, Allison, James Silver Oak, Consulting LLC, Linda Foster, and several related entities had become one of the most closely watched corporate cases in Ohio that year. Business journalists lined the hallway outside the courtroom. Former employees quietly filled the public gallery. Representatives from insurance companies, accounting firms, and corporate law offices attended to observe the proceedings. Bryan arrived through a private entrance with Rebecca Sullivan, Michael Turner, and Marcus Reed. None of them spoke very much. There was little left to discuss. The evidence had been exchanged. The depositions had concluded. Expert reports had been submitted. Now everything depended on the court. Rebecca carried only one briefcase. Months earlier, she would have needed several. Now nearly every disputed fact had already been admitted through testimony or authenticated documents. As they entered the courtroom, Bryan noticed Allison sitting beside her attorney. She looked nothing like the confident woman who had once encouraged him to sign financial documents over dinner. Her shoulders were slumped. She stared at the table instead of looking around the courtroom. Across the aisle sat Ethan Parker. He avoided looking toward Allison entirely. Bryan understood immediately. Whatever alliance had once existed between them had ended long before this day. The judge entered. Everyone stood. After routine procedural matters, Rebecca delivered the opening statement. She never raised her voice. She never dramatized the facts. Instead, she walked the court through a simple chronology. 3 years of planning, shell companies, fraudulent invoices, forged executive signatures, insurance manipulation, a planned divorce, an attempted corporate takeover. She paused before making her final point. This case is not about a failed investment. It is not about a marriage that ended. It is about deliberate deception designed to obtain property through fraud. She returned to counsel table. The defense argued that Bryan had orchestrated an elaborate test that created confusion inside the company. Rebecca never objected. She had expected that argument. When it was time to present evidence, Michael Turner became the first witness. He calmly explained every financial chart, every accounting discrepancy, every forensic examination. Using enlarged exhibits, he showed how legitimate invoices had gradually been replaced by inflated billing over 34 months. Defense counsel attempted to challenge his methodology. Michael answered every question precisely. He cited accounting standards, independent verification, third-party audits. By the end of cross-examination, even the defense experts had little left to dispute. Next came Marcus Reed. He explained every surveillance photograph, every observation, every timestamp, every image had been obtained from public locations. Every report had been written immediately after each observation. Defense counsel suggested that photographs could not prove conversations. Marcus agreed. They cannot. They simply establish who met where they met and when. That answer strengthened his credibility. He never exaggerated. He never claimed more than the evidence supported. Then Daniel Hargrove testified. He admitted failing to verify signatures. He admitted relying on Ethan Parker's representations. Most importantly, he repeated under oath that Bryan James had never authorized insurance amendments. Finally, Linda Foster took the witness stand. She identified her handwritten notebook. Page by page, she confirmed the entries she had made over nearly 3 years. Meeting dates, invoice numbers, specific instructions. She admitted her own misconduct openly. I processed invoices I knew should have been questioned. The judge looked directly at her. Why tell the truth now? Linda answered quietly. Because every day I stayed silent, I became more responsible. The courtroom remained silent. Then came the testimony everyone had been waiting for. Allison James. She walked slowly to the witness stand. She looked toward Bryan only once. He did not return her gaze. After taking the oath, she answered Rebecca's questions without hesitation. She admitted discussing financial control. She admitted participating in the creation of the divorce strategy. She admitted helping conceal meetings with Ethan. She admitted lying repeatedly to Bryan when Rebecca asked why Allison's voice broke. I believed money would make me feel secure. It never did. The defense attorney attempted to limit the damage. Mrs. James, were you threatened by Ethan Parker? No. Were you forced to participate? No. Did Bryan James ever mistreat you financially? No. The attorney paused. Then why? Allison closed her eyes. Because I convinced myself that wanting more justified taking what wasn't mine. No one spoke. Her answer echoed through the courtroom. Then Ethan Parker took the witness stand. Unlike Allison, he answered many questions with brief denials. When confronted with ownership records, he claimed he had forgotten. When confronted with emails, he claimed they had been misunderstood. When confronted with financial transfers, he blamed accounting staff. Rebecca never argued. She simply introduced another exhibit after every denial. By the end of the afternoon, Ethan had contradicted his own deposition testimony multiple times. The judge noticed. So did everyone else. The final witness was Bryan James. Rebecca asked only a few questions. Mr. James, why did you announce that you had lost your fortune? Bryan answered honestly. Because I believed someone close to me was manipulating company finances. Did you accuse anyone publicly? No. Did you fabricate evidence? No. Did you alter financial records? No. What did you do? I waited. Rebecca nodded. Why? Bryan looked toward the judge. My father taught me that character is easiest to see when people believe no one is watching. I wanted the truth, not revenge. The courtroom remained completely silent. The defense attorney stood for cross-examination. Mr. James, you intentionally deceived people. I publicly announced a financial collapse. Yes. Would you agree that your actions encouraged others to make poor decisions? Bryan answered calmly. No. I created an opportunity. They made their own decisions. The defense attorney tried again. If you had never announced financial problems, Bryan interrupted gently, then there would have been no forged documents after the announcement. No emergency wire transfers. No rushed restructuring. No accelerated fraud. They chose every action themselves. The attorney sat down. He had no further questions. Closing arguments took place the following morning. Rebecca stood before the court one final time. She did not speak about betrayal. She did not speak about emotions. She spoke about choices. Every defendant had opportunities to stop. Instead, each decision led to another. The conspiracy survived because every participant believed someone else would bear the consequences. She looked briefly toward Bryan. Today, the evidence shows otherwise. The judge recessed for several hours before returning with the decision. Everyone stood. The courtroom became completely silent. The judge reviewed the findings carefully. The court found overwhelming evidence of civil fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, conspiracy, fraudulent transfers, forgery, unjust enrichment. Judgment was entered jointly against Ethan Parker and Allison James for damages restitution attorney's fees and permanent injunctions preventing them from exercising authority over any remaining disputed corporate interests. The court also ordered the dissolution of Silver Oak Consulting LLC and referred portions of the evidence to the appropriate state and federal authorities for any further criminal review they deemed appropriate. When the judge finished reading the decision, no one celebrated. Bryan simply closed his eyes for a moment. Rebecca quietly placed one hand on his shoulder. Michael smiled with relief. Marcus exhaled deeply. Across the courtroom, Allison lowered her head. Ethan stared forward without expression. 3 years of carefully constructed deception had ended not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a judge quietly reading the truth into the official record. As everyone slowly began leaving the courtroom, Bryan realized the verdict had returned far more than his company. It had returned something he thought he had lost forever. The certainty that honesty, though often slower than deception, eventually reaches the finish line first. 1 year later, the headquarters of James Industrial Solutions looked remarkably different. The glass entrance reflected the morning sun over Columbus, but the changes inside the company were far more significant than the renovated lobby or the newly redesigned executive offices. Bryan James no longer occupied the corner office alone. The office itself remained. The culture surrounding it had changed. Every executive decision now required documented approval. Independent compliance officers reviewed major transactions. Vendor relationships were audited continuously. Insurance policies required multiple levels of verification. No single executive possessed unchecked authority anymore. What had once seemed excessive now felt like common sense. Bryan stood outside the main conference room watching a group of young managers participate in a leadership workshop. On the screen behind the instructor appeared a single sentence: "Trust is built by transparency, not assumptions." Bryan smiled quietly. A year earlier, he would have considered that statement ordinary. Now he understood its value more deeply than ever. Rebecca Sullivan joined him in the hallway. "I thought I'd find you here." Bryan laughed softly. "You know me too well." She handed him a folder. "The final recovery report." Bryan opened it slowly. Every stolen dollar that could legally be recovered had been traced. Corporate assets had been returned. Fraudulent vendor contracts had been terminated. Insurance policies had been corrected. The restitution process had restored millions of dollars to the company. Not everything had been recovered. Some funds had disappeared through foreign accounts before preservation orders reached them. Rebecca pointed to the final page. Considering where this began, I'd call that a remarkable outcome. Bryan nodded. I agree. But the money isn't what matters most. Rebecca smiled. I know. Michael Turner entered carrying coffee for everyone. The external audit finished yesterday. Bryan accepted a cup. How did we do? Michael grinned. For the first time in company history. Not a single material weakness. Bryan laughed. I'll take that. Marcus Reed arrived a few moments later. Although his investigation had ended months earlier, he had remained a trusted advisor. He handed Bryan another envelope. Something personal. Bryan looked puzzled. What is it? A letter? From who? Open it. Bryan carefully unfolded the handwritten letter. It came from Linda Foster. She had completed her court-ordered cooperation requirements and accepted responsibility for her actions. Her letter contained no excuses, only gratitude. She thanked Bryan for choosing accountability instead of public humiliation. She wrote that losing her career had forced her to rebuild her life honestly. She had accepted a bookkeeping position at a non-profit organization serving struggling families. I can't erase what I did, she wrote, but I can decide who I become next. Bryan folded the letter carefully. I hope she succeeds. Marcus nodded. So do I. Rebecca looked thoughtful. People rarely change because they're punished. They change because they're honest. Bryan quietly placed the letter inside his desk. Later that afternoon, another visitor arrived unexpectedly. Daniel Hargrove. He no longer worked in the insurance industry. After disciplinary proceedings, he had voluntarily surrendered several professional certifications. Bryan welcomed him into his office. I wasn't sure you'd want to see me. Bryan motioned toward a chair. Please. Daniel sat. I came to apologize. You already testified. I know, but I never apologized. Bryan remained silent. Daniel continued. I spent years believing professionalism meant trusting the people sitting across the table. I forgot that professionalism also means verifying what they tell you. Bryan nodded. We all learned that lesson eventually. Daniel smiled sadly. Some of us pay more for it. Before leaving, Daniel extended his hand. Bryan shook it. Neither man mentioned the lawsuit again. Some conversations no longer required additional words. That evening, Bryan drove home. The house felt different. Not because it had changed physically, because it was quiet. Peacefully quiet. The legal process surrounding his divorce had concluded months earlier. He no longer associated every room with hidden conversations or secret phone calls. The bedroom door where he had first overheard Allison's whispered betrayal remained exactly where it had always been. Yet it no longer held power over him. He opened the door. The room stood empty. Sunlight streamed through the windows. He smiled faintly before quietly closing it again. Some memories deserved to remain in the past. A few weeks later, Bryan accepted an invitation to speak at Ohio State University. Business students filled the auditorium. Most expected him to discuss entrepreneurship, corporate growth, investment strategies. Instead, he began with a different story. When I started my company, I believed success depended on intelligence. Later, I believed it depended on hard work. He paused. I was wrong both times. The room became silent. Success depends on character. Because intelligence can manipulate. Hard work can build dishonest systems. But character determines what you build and why. A student raised her hand. If you could go back, would you still pretend to lose your fortune? Bryan considered the question carefully. The auditorium waited. Finally, he answered. No. The students looked surprised. Bryan continued. I would rather have remained happily married. I would rather have trusted the people around me. I would rather none of it had happened. He smiled gently. But once I suspected the truth. I had a responsibility to uncover it. Another student asked, Do you regret trusting Allison? Bryan remained silent for several seconds. No. I regret that she chose to betray that trust. Those are different things. The students quietly wrote notes. After the lecture ended, dozens remained behind to speak with him. Not about business, not about money, about trust, integrity, leadership, forgiveness. Bryan answered every question honestly. Several months later, James Industrial Solutions received an award from the Ohio Business Ethics Council for implementing one of the state's strongest corporate governance programs. When Bryan accepted the recognition, reporters asked whether the award felt like vindication. He smiled. No. It feels like responsibility. Responsibility to prove that a company can become stronger after telling the truth. That evening, he returned to his office one final time before heading home. The building was quiet. Employees had already left. He stood beside the large window overlooking the Columbus skyline. Exactly 1 year earlier, he had stood in almost the same place believing his world had collapsed. Now he understood something different. His fortune had never truly been the money. It had been the values his parents taught him long before he founded a company. Integrity, patience, responsibility. Those were the assets no fraud could steal. He reached into his desk drawer and removed the small digital recorder that had captured Allison's first phone call. For months he had kept it as evidence. Now the trials were over, the appeals had concluded, justice had been served. He erased the recording. Then he placed the recorder into a storage box and closed the lid. Some chapters deserved to be remembered, others deserved to be finished. As Bryan turned off the lights and walked toward the elevator, he realized the greatest victory had never been exposing a conspiracy or recovering his company. It was leaving the bitterness behind without leaving his principles behind as well. Because fortunes can be rebuilt. Companies can recover, reputations can be restored. But the one investment that compounds throughout an entire lifetime is integrity. And in the end, that was the only fortune Bryan James had never pretended to lose. If this story teaches us anything, it's that the greatest losses in life are not always financial. Money can be earned again. Businesses can be rebuilt. Even shattered plans can be replaced. But once trust is broken, restoring it requires far more than words. Real character is revealed not when life is easy, but when temptation appears and no one seems to be watching. Integrity is a choice we make every single day in the small decisions that no one applauds, and the difficult moments when taking the wrong path seems easier. Bryan didn't win because he was richer, smarter, or more powerful than everyone else. He prevailed because he refused to abandon his values even when betrayal came from the person he loved most. In the end, honesty may move slowly, but it has a way of catching up to every lie. Let this story remind you to choose people for their character rather than their promises, to protect your principles more carefully than your possessions, and to remember that true success is measured not by what you own, but by who you become through life's hardest trials. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. What was the most powerful lesson you took away from Bryan's journey? Have you ever experienced a betrayal that ultimately made you stronger? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story may encourage someone who needs it today. And if you enjoy meaningful stories about resilience, justice, and the power of integrity, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next inspiring story.